you gorgeous individuals, it's Kav here, and welcome back to episode 3 of Diversity 101. If you're new here, Diversity 101 is a series I run on my channel where I kind of break down some of the basics of diversity and diversity related topics and make specific videos dedicated to conversations about those topics. So I have 2 previous videos. The first one is titled What is Diversity? It's basically an introduction to the series and it focuses on what the terms diversity and representation mean and the difference between the two. And then I have a second video that I made earlier this summer that's about diversity within the book reader and reviewer community and how to support content creators from marginalized backgrounds. Now, this third episode is dedicated to the own voices movement, the term own voices, what it means, why it's important, and the positives and negatives of this term. Because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot and it's something people involved in this part of the book community talk about a lot, but I think sometimes we need to step back and actually take a look at what term we are throwing out there, what word we're using, and what it actually means. So that's what I wanted to discuss today. So without further ado, let's get started. So the term own voices started as a Twitter hashtag that was coined by a sci-fi author named Corinne Duvis, who created the term in September of 2015 when certain important discussions were being had. She coined this term in order to recommend kidlit about diverse characters written by authors from the same diverse group, and those are her exact words that I pulled from her exact tweet. So since then, the term has kind of taken on a life of its own and gets used a lot, specifically in many book Twitter discussions. It's kind of just grown and become something bigger than it started out as. So what does the term own voices really mean? The term own voices means that the content creator or the reviewer in question shares the same identity as the marginalized character they are creating or reviewing. For example, a book like When Dimple Met Rishi is own voices for Indian American representation because the author, Sandhya Menon, is Indian American herself, so she shares the same identity as the 2 main characters, Dimple Shah and Rishi Patel. This is true of many different pieces of work. That was just the first one that came to my mind because the book is right there on my bookshelf, but there are many different pieces of media and literature that share this same own voices representation, either on the author side as the author or content creator created this character, or on the reviewer side, meaning that the reviewer shares the same identity as the character they are reviewing. For example, I am an own voices reviewer of When Dimple Met Rishi because I myself am also Indian American, so I share the same identity as Dimple Shah and Rishi Patel. So you might be wondering, why is this important? Why do we care about this? Why does this matter? The reason this matters is that for a long time, and even still today, the stories of marginalized people haven't been falling into the hands of marginalized people. They haven't been in control of the people who have truly lived these experiences and who truly know and understand these experiences. That's not to say that non-own voices work can never exist. Non-own voices work can exist, and I will get to that later and talk about how it can be done well, because some of the best forms of representation out there for some people are through non-own voices work, and that is valid and that is important and that is just as necessary. So I'm not here to diss all non-own voices work. I'm here to discuss the fact that this label does exist for a reason and it is important for a reason. So in my first Diversity 101 video, I spent a long time discussing the difference between diversity and representation because there is a difference, and a lot of times with own voices work, you get the most authentic form of representation you can get because you're getting the representation from someone who truly knows what they're talking about, because what they're talking about is their own experience, and when it's an identity that does not get shared a lot, that does not get represented a lot, it's kind of crucial that it be done well because so little of that representation exists. And like I said, this doesn't mean that non-own voices representation isn't important, because it is still important and it is still necessary. For example, Salmon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda is one of the most widely adored books featuring a gay main character, but it's written by an author who identifies as straight, and that doesn't change the fact that that book is still good representation and it's been so accessible to so many queer readers, and the fact that it's important to such a wide queer audience, that doesn't erase that in any which way. The thing is, the content creator has to, one, take the time to do the representation properly. You have to spend time doing research. You have to spend time actually learning about that identity and making sure you represent that well. And then you have to consult sensitivity readers. That is so important to representing a non-own voices identity. You need sensitivity readers. And if a content creator truly cares and they're creating that character for the right reason, then you know what? They can, as long as they make the judgment call that it's okay for them to write that voice. The fact of the matter is that in publishing and in media, there are only so many slots that are given to characters of marginalized identities, and that sucks. And if we could have books by own voices and non-own voices creators alike, and we could just fill the shelves with them, then this wouldn't be as big of a problem. But right now, with where we're at in this process, there are still only a certain number of slots given to characters of marginalized identities, and you have to consider if you are taking that slot from someone else. If you think that it's okay for you to write that story, you can be the judge of that. But if you think that maybe that slot deserves to go to a content creator who actually comes from that identity and who would be able to represent that better, then you know what? Maybe that's the call you need to make, and you need to write a different story. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that it's my job to make that call for you. It's not. It's a personal thing. You have to reflect on whether or not you think that that identity is one you should be writing, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not, and you need to make that decision for yourself. It's really just dependent on the time and the person and the story they're writing. You have to consider whether it's okay for you to tell it. That being said, whereas I do want to discuss all of the positives that come with the label Own Voices and the power it does have, we also do have to acknowledge that there are some negatives that come with it. The first one, which is a big one, is the pressure that comes from Own Voices content creators and reviewers to get everything absolutely perfect. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that it's important that representation of people with marginalized identities be done well, because sometimes that's the only representation that certain teens and media consumers have access to. But that being said, no one group of people is ever a monolith. I have said this many times in my videos because it is so true. We do not all have the exact same experience with our identities. There are differences, there are nuances to that, and no one piece of media can represent everyone accurately. And that's okay, because something not representing you accurately doesn't necessarily make it bad representation. Whereas I think that a lot of times we need to have a more in-depth conversation about what that means and how to differentiate the two. I don't have time for all the nitty-grittiness of that conversation in this video, but I do want to acknowledge that just because something might not represent you 100% accurately, it doesn't necessarily make it bad representation, and that's a habit a lot of readers and reviewers and such fall into sometimes. And here's an example. The book Love, Hate, and Other Filters by Samira Ahmed has Own Voices Indian American representation. Now, I love that book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but that being said, the representation of the Indian American main character, Maya, did not reflect my experience at all. She had a completely different experience than me, but I knew that that didn't make it bad representation. It was still good representation, and that will be so accessible to a different Indian American teen somewhere who'll say, oh, that represents my exact experience, because two people can have a different experience, and that's not a bad thing. And the author wrote her experience, and she wrote authentically from her background and whatever she's experienced, and it's not my place to call that bad representation. So just because something doesn't represent you doesn't automatically make it bad and problematic, and terms like own voices and problematic are terms we throw around a lot oftentimes without actually considering what they mean. And I think we need to be mindful of the labels we're throwing on stuff and considering whether it's actually important and whether it's actually accurate. And that pressure also exists on the other side. Oftentimes, Own Voices reviewers are pressured to find every single aspect of a book or movie or TV show that might not be perfect, that might be problematic. Putting that kind of pressure on a reviewer is completely unfair. As someone who cares so greatly about diversity and representation in media, I try to read books as critically as I can and watch media as critically as I can and consider whether representation is being done well, but you cannot put that kind of pressure on 1 or 2 reviewers and expect them to find every single flaw. That same pressure is not put on privileged reviewers, and I'm not saying I want it to be put on privileged reviewers because they don't deserve that either, but no party should have that kind of pressure put on them. We should acknowledge that most people are doing their best to read and consume media with that kind of critical eye and consider when things might not be done well, but no one person can figure out every single problem one piece of media or one piece of literature has. I think it's important that people do get a warning if representation is going to be bad or harmful for them, because that kind of stuff can be triggering and harmful to people and no one deserves that, but that shouldn't be done at the cost of another reviewer. I think that we just need to be considerate about how much we expect from people, because a lot of times people are doing their best, and just like I'm not perfect and you're not perfect, no other author or reviewer is going to be. And I think that sometimes we do need to cut people a little bit of slack. The other biggest criticism that comes with the Own Voices term exists mainly in terms of queer representation, but it can exist in terms of other forms of representation, and that's that some authors or reviewers might not be out. And that is definitely true, and that's something I've tried to be more mindful of when I describe books that might not necessarily be own voices, because I don't always know how the author identifies, because just because an author might not be out as not cis or not straight, I can't make that blanket statement to other people. And that's not to say that just because something might be own voices, that means that it has to be perfect, because own voices representation can be harmful as well. But it's more, I think, the rush to categorize this book as completely not own voices, the author is straight, because we don't always know. And I try to word it more so I say this author, as far as I know, is straight, or this author to my knowledge has not come out as anything other than straight. But just because someone hasn't come out, that doesn't make the default straight, and that's a different conversation about defaulting to cis and straight. But that's also another thing we need to acknowledge, that we don't always know everyone's exact identity. We don't always know their religion or their sexuality or some parts of their identity, and we can't always rush judgment. And I'm not saying I haven't been guilty of it, because I have too, but it's something I'm trying to be more mindful of going forward and consider that there might be parts of the story we don't know yet. But those negatives being said, there are also positives to the term own voices. It gives authors and content creators and reviewers with the same identity as their marginalized character a term to hold on to, a term to show that, hey, I wrote this from my own experience, or I read this from my own experience. It gives a term to describe an important part of a representation experience. You know, and in my journey of reading and consuming a lot of media, I found that a lot of times own voices representation has an authenticity to it that non-own voices representation doesn't always give. There is an authentic feel that comes, specifically in representation of people of color. I've seen that that is very, very prevalent, because there are so many intricate details when you come from another culture, and a lot of times if you haven't lived that experience, it's hard to get all of that down on the page. And I find that own voices content creators have a much easier time of doing that. So there are also positives to this term, and I think that we in this community, and me included obviously, just need to start using the term own voices for what it is, and consider that it does have power, but not give it too much power and not make it the end-all be-all. Just consider that it's a term used to describe an important part of the representation experience, but that it's not the end-all be-all, and that it shouldn't be the only thing we focus on. It's just an important contributor. So that's my 2 cents on the term own voices, and I'm very interested in hearing what you guys have to say. You know, this is a relatively new term that's just kind of grown and evolved into something bigger and not always better. So what do you think about the term? Let me know in the comments below, because I am interested to continue this discussion and hear your guys' thoughts, as well as that's part of the reason I am doing this series. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe, because that stuff makes me happy. And as I said, comment down below and let me know more of your thoughts so we can continue having an important discussion. And that is all. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are. Please remember that you're beautiful and you deserve the world, and I will see you soon for a brand new video. Goodbye!